My family thought it would be absolutely hilarious to leave me stranded in a dense, isolated forest with nothing but the clothes on my back. Let us see if she can survive out there. They laughed as their car sped down the dirt road, leaving me entirely alone in the fading light. I never came back to them. 18 years later, they were sitting in my boardroom begging an anonymous investor for their financial lives. I am Rebecca, 33 years old, and today I am the CEO who holds their entire future in the palm of my hand. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned a painful family betrayal into your greatest weapon. The glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor of my Chicago headquarters offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. It was an intimidating room designed specifically to make visitors feel small. Standing out of sight in the adjacent private hallway, I watched through the tinted one-way glass as my biological family squirmed in their leather chairs. They had been waiting for 45 minutes. That was a deliberate choice on my part. I wanted them to feel the anxiety simmering in their veins. My father Richard sat at the far end of the massive mahogany table. His once immaculate posture was gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a man drowning in debt. He kept wiping his sweaty palms on his expensive but outdated suit trousers. Beside him sat my mother Diane, violently tapping her perfectly manicured fingernails against her designer handbag. She kept checking her reflection in her compact mirror, desperately trying to maintain the facade of a wealthy socialite despite the fact that their company accounts were overdrawn and their credit lines were frozen. Then there was my older sister Madison. At 35, she was still the golden child, the undisputed center of their universe. She looked furious, pacing back and forth across the plush carpet, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This is incredibly unprofessional," Madison complained loudly, her voice easily carrying through the hidden microphones into my earpiece. "Who does this CEO think they are making us wait almost an hour? We are offering them the prime real estate of Bear Creek. They should be rolling out the red carpet for us, not leaving us in this freezing room." Her husband Jamal sat quietly at the table reviewing a stack of architectural blueprints. Jamal was a brilliant 36-year-old African-American architect who had been dragged into my family's toxic web. From my background checks, I knew he was the only reason their development firm had not collapsed 5 years ago. He was the brains behind their operations, yet they treated him like a subordinate. "Madison, please sit down," Jamal said, rubbing his temples in frustration. "We are not in a position to make demands today. The bank is going to foreclose on the company and your parents' house by 5 o'clock this afternoon if we do not secure this buyout. Vanguard Holdings is the only firm willing to offer cash for the Bear Creek property. We need them. They do not need us." Madison glared at him. "Do not talk to me like I am an idiot, Jamal. This is just a power play. My father built a real estate empire. We deserve respect." "An empire built on sand," Richard muttered, staring blankly at the table. "Just keep quiet, Madison. We need this $15 million buyout. If we lose the Bear Creek Woods, we lose everything." I smiled coldly in the hallway. They were completely unaware that the anonymous private equity firm that had systematically cornered them in the market was founded and run by the very daughter they threw away. For 18 years, I had clawed my way up from the foster care system, working grueling hours in finance while putting myself through night school. I built Vanguard Holdings from a ruthless tiny startup into a corporate titan that swallowed failing businesses whole. And for the last 2 years, I had been quietly buying up their bad debts through shell companies. It was time. I signaled my lead attorney and my executive assistant to follow me. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning was immediately drowned out by the sharp click of my heels against the hardwood floor. I wore a tailored charcoal Armani suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, sleek style. I looked nothing like the terrified, scrawny 15-year-old girl they had left weeping in the wilderness. The three of them looked up, but there was absolutely no recognition in their eyes. To them, I was just another corporate suit in a high-rise building. Madison let out an exaggerated sigh of relief and snapped her fingers at me. "Finally, someone shows up." Listen, sweetie, I need a non-fat iced macchiato right now, and you need to tell your boss that Richard and Diane are losing their patience. We have another meeting to get to. Jamal closed his eyes and shook his head, clearly mortified by his wife's blatant disrespect. Madison, stop, he hissed. My father offered a tight, strained smile, trying to do damage control. Please excuse my daughter, miss. We are just a bit anxious. If you could kindly let the CEO know we have all the contracts ready for the Bear Creek acquisition, we would appreciate it. We were promised the buyout funds would be wired today. I did not move toward the coffee machine. I did not blink. I walked directly to the head of the massive table and stood behind the leather executive chair. My legal team fanned out beside me, placing a stack of heavy, thick binders onto the glass surface with a resounding thud. The silence in the room suddenly grew heavy. The air felt uncomfortably thick. Madison frowned, looking from my lawyers back to me, her annoyance slowly shifting into confusion. I am not getting you coffee, Madison, I said, my voice dead calm, echoing perfectly in the large acoustic space. And I am not going to fetch the CEO because she is already standing right in front of you. Diane let out a nervous little laugh, glancing at Richard. Oh, my apologies. They did not tell us the head of Vanguard Holdings was a woman. We are thrilled to meet you. Meet. I rested my hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. My eyes locked directly onto my father, then shifted to my mother, and finally settled on Madison's arrogant face. You should be, I replied, though I am surprised you do not recognize me. Then again, the last time you looked at me, I was begging you to unlock the car doors while it was getting dark in the middle of nowhere. The color instantly drained from Diane's face. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Richard gripped the edges of the glass table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. I watched the exact second their brains processed my facial features, bridging the gap between the teenage girl they abandoned and the ruthless corporate raider standing before them. You, Madison whispered, taking a stumbling step backward. Her designer bag slipped from her shoulder and hit the floor. Rebecca. Yes, Madison. Rebecca. I smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that offered no warmth whatsoever. I straightened my posture and gestured to the files my lawyers had brought. The last time we saw each other, you told me to find my own way back from Bear Creek Woods to prove I was not a useless burden to this family. You all laughed as you drove away. You told me to survive. I paused, letting the absolute horror wash over their faces before delivering the final blow. Well, I survived, and today I brought the entire forest to this table. Please sit down. We have a lot of financial ruin to discuss. For an agonizing minute, nobody moved. The absolute silence in the boardroom was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the building ventilation system. I watched their minds working frantically, trying to reconcile the discarded teenager they had left for dead, with the billionaire holding the deed to their lives. Then my mother's survival instincts kicked into high gear. I saw the exact moment Diane decided on her strategy. The genuine shock on her face melted away, replaced instantly by a theatrical mask of overwhelming maternal anguish. Her eyes filled with tears that fell perfectly over her expensive blush. She let out a dramatic, breathy gasp and threw her hands over her mouth. Oh my God, she sobbed, taking a sudden rush step toward me. Rebecca, my baby, my sweet lost girl, you are alive. She lunged forward, arms outstretched, her diamond bracelets clinking together. She was going for a hug, aiming to wrap me in that cloying, expensive perfume I remembered from my childhood. She wanted to create a touching reunion, a moment of tearful forgiveness that would magically erase the past and, more importantly, save their crumbling company. I took one precise step backward. Do not touch me, I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it carried a sharp, glacial authority that stopped her dead in her tracks. Keep your distance, Diane. We are not at a family reunion. We are at a corporate acquisition meeting. Diane stood frozen, her arms still awkwardly suspended in the air. She quickly pulled them back to her chest, clasping her hands together as if praying to me. The tears flowed faster now, ruining her perfectly applied mascara. How can you be so cold? She wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured heartbreak. We have been in agony, Rebecca. Absolute agony for 18 years. Do you have any idea what you put us through? What we suffered? I tilted my head studying her performance. It was genuinely impressive. If I did not know the truth, I might have actually felt sorry for her. You suffered? I asked, keeping my tone entirely neutral. Yes, Diane cried, stepping forward again, though she wisely kept out of arm's reach. We never meant to leave you out there. It was just a joke. A stupid, terrible joke Madison suggested to toughen you up. But we came back. We drove down the road for 5 minutes, and then Richard turned the car around. We came right back to that exact spot by the clearing. She placed a hand over her heart, looking around the room as if seeking sympathy from my lawyers, who remained completely stoic. When we got back, you were gone, she continued, her voice cracking perfectly. We scoured those woods, Rebecca. We walked through the dark calling your name until our throats were raw. We searched for hours, but you had just vanished. You ran away into the dark, and we could not find you anywhere. Do you know how many nights I have lain awake crying, wondering if my little girl was safe? We thought someone had taken you. We thought you were dead. Madison, having recovered slightly from her initial shock, recognized the lifeline her mother was throwing them. She immediately jumped in to support the narrative. It is true, Madison chimed in, her arrogant tone replaced by a shaky, defensive whine. We panicked. We drove around the perimeter of the national park until morning. Mom had a total breakdown in the back seat. We tried to find you, but you just disappeared on purpose. Why did you run away from the spot where we left you? If you had just stayed put, we would have picked you up. I stood completely still, letting their lies hang in the sterile air of the boardroom. I looked at Jamal, who was sitting at the table. He was staring at his wife and his mother-in-law with an expression of pure disbelief. He was a smart man. He could hear the desperate, frantic holes in their story. I looked back at Diane. Her chest was heaving with fake sobs. She pulled a silk handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed at her eyes, watching me closely from behind the fabric to see if her performance was working. It was fascinating to watch them rewrite history in real time. They were trying to shift the blame onto a 15-year-old girl. They were framing my survival as a malicious act of running away, framing my disappearance as my own fault, framing their horrific abandonment as a minor prank gone slightly wrong. You came back for me, I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue slowly. Yes, my father Richard finally spoke up, stepping up beside Diane and placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. He put on his best authoritative but wounded father expression. We came back immediately. We spent fortunes trying to locate you over the years. Private investigators, missing persons databases, everything money could buy. But you had completely fallen off the grid. You broke your mother's heart, Rebecca. You broke our family. But thank God you are safe. Thank God you are here now. We can finally be a family again. I let out a low, humorless laugh that made Richard flinch. You spent fortunes, I said, walking slowly around the edge of the glass table, dragging my fingertips lightly along the smooth surface. That is incredibly fascinating, Richard. Because my private investigators found all of you in exactly 12 minutes when I decided to acquire your corporate debt. It is quite funny how a multi-million-dollar real estate developer with supposedly unlimited resources could not locate a teenage girl who was placed into the state foster care system right here in Illinois. Diane swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward Madison. We hired the best people, Diane insisted, her voice pitching higher. You must have changed your name. You must have hidden from us. I did not change my legal name until I turned 18, I stated flatly, stopping directly across the table from them. I was in the system under the exact name you gave me at birth. I attended public high schools. I applied for state grants. I existed in plain sight. But let us get back to your touching story about returning to the woods. I leaned forward, bracing my hands on the glass, staring directly into Diane's watering eyes. You said you came back after 5 minutes, I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. But I sat on that rotting log by the dirt road for 9 hours. I sat there as the sun went down. I sat there as the temperature dropped to freezing. I sat there listening to the wolves howling, terrified to move even an inch because I believed my family was coming back to get me. I stayed exactly where you left me until 3 o'clock in the morning when a park ranger finally found me half dead from hypothermia. Diane's face turned this color of ash. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Do not stand in my boardroom and insult my intelligence with your pathetic tears, Diane. I snapped, my voice suddenly echoing like a whip crack. You did not turn the car around. You drove straight back to your luxury cabin, drank wine, and went to sleep while your youngest daughter was freezing to death in a bear-infested forest. You never looked for me. You just went on with your lives, relieved that you finally got rid of the daughter who did not fit into your perfect country club image. Madison slammed her hand on the table, her true aggressive nature breaking through the fake victim routine. You are making that up. Madison yelled, her face turning red. You were always a liar, Rebecca. You were always causing trouble and making us look bad. We made a mistake, okay? We made one mistake and you are going to hold it over our heads forever to justify ruining our business. You owe this family. We gave you a roof over your head for 15 years. I looked at Madison and smiled a terrible, chilling smile. Jamal, who had been completely silent, finally spoke up. His voice was low, thick with disgust. Madison, is this true? Did you actually leave a 15-year-old girl in the woods as a joke? Madison whipped her head toward her husband. Stay out of this, Jamal. This is family business. She is just trying to make us look like monsters to justify her hostile takeover. Oh, I do not need to make you look like monsters, Madison, I said, walking back to my executive chair and taking a seat. I smoothed the lapels of my suit jacket and gave my lead attorney a brief nod. You do an excellent job of doing that all by yourselves. Now cut the theatrical weeping. Wipe your face, Diane. We are done talking about the past. I pulled the thick binder toward me and flipped it open to the first page. You came here today to beg Vanguard Holdings to buy the Bear Creek Woods to save your bankrupt development firm, I stated, shifting entirely into my ruthless corporate persona. You requested $15 million. You claimed it was prime, untainted real estate ready for immediate luxury development. Richard visibly relaxed just a fraction, seemingly relieved that the conversation had moved back to familiar business territory. He adjusted his tie and sat down, pulling his own documents forward. Yes, Richard said, clearing his throat and trying to summon his old arrogance. It is a highly lucrative plot. We have all the environmental clearances and zoning permits right here. It is a gold mine, Rebecca. We are offering you a very fair deal. It is practically a family discount. I looked at him, my expression devoid of any human empathy. There are no family discounts, Richard replied. And I am not giving you $15 million. Richard slammed his fist onto the glass table, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. You cannot do this. You gave us a preliminary term sheet. We have an agreement in principle. You are letting your petty childhood grievances ruin a perfectly viable business transaction. A term sheet is not a binding contract, Richard replied, leaning back in my leather chair. And the only thing ruining this transaction is the actual value of what you are trying to sell me. Madison leaped from her chair screeching harshly against the carpet. You are just doing this to punish us. This is completely illegal. I will call the press. I will sue you for every single dime Vanguard Holdings is worth. You are holding a grudge over a camping trip from 18 years ago and using it to destroy our family legacy. Sit down, Madison, Jamal said. His voice boomed across the room. It was not a request. It was a command. For a second, even my sister was stunned into absolute silence by the sheer force of her husband's tone. Madison opened her mouth to argue, but Jamal shot her a glare so intense she slowly sank back into her seat, crossing her arms and pouting like a petulant child. Jamal stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He took a deep, steadying breath, visibly compartmentalizing the disgust he had felt minutes earlier regarding my abandonment. He was separating the horrifying family drama from the immediate corporate crisis. He was a professional trying to save his firm, his employees, and his own livelihood. Ms. Williams, Jamal began using my legal last name respectfully, deliberately shifting the dynamic away from toxic family history and toward strict business. I understand that the personal history here is catastrophic. I cannot excuse what they did to you, and I will not try. But I am asking you to look at this deal strictly as the CEO of Vanguard Holdings. Bear Creek is not just empty land. It is an untapped gold mine for sustainable luxury development. I gestured toward him with an open palm. Go ahead, Jamal. I am listening. Jamal opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a series of large, beautifully rendered architectural blueprints. He spread them across the glass table. I looked down and had to admit I was genuinely impressed. The designs were breathtaking. This is the Bear Creek Eco Resort. Jamal explained, his voice steady and passionate. The luxury travel market is shifting rapidly towards sustainability and immersive nature experiences. We have designed a 50-villa resort that integrates flawlessly into the existing forest canopy. We are utilizing solar harvesting, advanced water recycling systems, and zero-impact foundations. The target demographic is ultra-high net worth individuals looking for private off-grid wellness retreats. He tapped a specific section of the blueprints showing the topographical integration. Because the land is completely pristine, we can market this as a virgin ecological sanctuary, he continued. The initial projections show a full return on investment within 36 months of completion. Vanguard Holdings specializes in distressed assets and undervalued real estate. At $15 million for 500 acres of prime untouched forest, with these fully permitted designs, you are buying in at a fraction of the projected valuation. The land alone justifies the price. The architectural intellectual property makes it a steal. He finished his pitch and stood tall, maintaining direct eye contact with me. He was not begging. He was negotiating with facts, data, and undeniable talent. I looked at the blueprints, then looked up at Jamal. I let the silence stretch for a moment. You are an incredibly gifted architect, Jamal. I said, my tone shifting to genuine respect. Your integration of sustainable energy systems with luxury aesthetics is brilliant. You have designed a masterpiece that respects the environment. It is a profound irony that you designed it for a family that respects absolutely nothing. Jamal swallowed hard but nodded, acknowledging the compliment. Then you can see the value of the $15 million buyout, he pressed gently. I sighed and closed the blueprint closest to me. I see the value in your design, Jamal. Unfortunately, your father-in-law has made sure that your beautiful design will never be built on that land. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, a sudden sheen of sweat appearing on his forehead. What are you talking about? Richard demanded, his voice slightly higher than usual. The designs are perfect, the zoning is approved. I ignored Richard and kept my eyes locked on Jamal. Jamal, when you designed this eco-resort, you based your zero-impact foundations and your water recycling systems on the geological and soil reports provided by Richard, correct? Of course, Jamal answered, a slight frown forming between his brows. I personally reviewed the core samples and the environmental impact studies conducted last year. The soil is pristine. The groundwater is perfectly balanced. I have the certified geological report right here. Jamal reached into his briefcase and slid a thick spiral-bound document across the glass table toward me. It bore the seal of a prominent environmental testing agency. I did not even bother to look at it. Instead, I snapped my fingers. My lead attorney immediately stepped forward and dropped a heavy red folder directly on top of Jamal's document. The red folder bore the unmistakable bold seal of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Jamal, you are a brilliant architect, I said softly, leaning forward, but your father-in-law is a federal criminal. The air in the boardroom evaporated. Jamal stared at the red folder, then slowly looked over at Richard. Richard's face had turned a sickening shade of gray. He looked like he was about to vomit. Open it, I instructed Jamal. Jamal reached out with a trembling hand and flipped open the red folder. His eyes scanned the first page, and I watched his jaw drop. He quickly flipped to the second page, then the third, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. 2 years ago, Richard Development Firm was contracted to demolish a massive industrial complex on the south side of the city. I explained, my voice ringing with cold precision. It was a highly lucrative government contract, but proper disposal of toxic industrial waste is expensive. It eats into profit margins. So Richard decided to save a few $1 million. He hired a shadow shipping company to haul thousands of tons of asbestos chemical runoff and contaminated industrial concrete off the grid. I pointed at the red folder in Jamal's hands. They dumped it in the Bear Creek woods, I stated. They buried highly toxic industrial waste right under the topsoil of your pristine, virgin ecological sanctuary. No, Diane gasped, clutching her chest. Richard, tell her that is a lie. Tell her. Richard said absolutely nothing. He was staring at the table, completely paralyzed by exposure. The document you are looking at, Jamal, is an active federal indictment and a remediation order from the EPA. I continued, methodically dismantling the last shreds of their business. The geological report Richard gave you was entirely forged. He paid a corrupt inspector to fake the core samples so he could secure the initial zoning permits for your eco-resort. He used your legitimate architectural reputation to mask a massive environmental crime. Jamal's hands were shaking as he read the federal violation codes. He looked up, his eyes burning with a mixture of shock and devastating rage. You forged the soil reports, Jamal asked, his voice dangerously low, directed entirely at Richard. You let me design a sustainable wellness retreat on top of a toxic waste dump. You let me submit these designs to the City Planning Commission under my architectural license. Richard finally found his voice, though it was weak and desperate. Jamal, listen to me. I was going to clean it up. I just needed the buyout money from Vanguard to pay for the secret remediation. We were going to dig it up before construction started. I had to forge the reports to get the permits so the land would look valuable enough to sell. I was trying to save the company. I was trying to save our family. You committed federal fraud, Madison shrieked, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. Her pristine, privileged world was crashing down around her. You used my husband's license to commit fraud. We could all go to federal prison. I was protecting our lifestyle, Richard roared back, slamming his hands on the table. You think your designer clothes and your country club memberships pay for themselves, Madison? The industrial demolition was bleeding us dry. I had to cut corners. You did not just cut corners, Richard Fye interjected, slicing through their pathetic screaming match. You poisoned the groundwater. The EPA has slapped a massive remediation fine on the Bear Creek property. The land is currently designated as a hazardous brownfield site. The cost to legally excavate and sanitize the soil is estimated at roughly $10 million. Furthermore, the federal fines attached to the property currently sit at $2.5 million. I leaned back, steepling my fingers together, watching the complete devastation wipe away their arrogant postures. So Jamal, let us review the math. I said, my tone brutally cheerful. You are asking me to pay $15 million for a piece of land that comes with $12.5 million in federal cleanup liabilities and fines. Land that cannot be developed for at least a decade while the soil recovers. Land that currently holds zero commercial value. Jamal dropped the forged geological report onto the table as if it burned his hands. He pushed his chair back, physically distancing himself from Richard and Madison. He looked completely shattered, realizing that the family he married into had turned him into an unwitting accomplice to a massive federal crime. He had poured his heart and soul into a project that was nothing but a smokescreen for illegal toxic dumping. You lied to me, Jamal whispered, glaring at his father-in-law with pure hatred. You used my name to legitimize a toxic wasteland. If the City Planning Commission finds out I submitted forged ecological data, I will be disbarred. I could face jail time. Oh, Jamal, you do not have to worry about the City Planning Commission finding out, I said, offering him a small, comforting smile. Because my legal team already submitted the real EPA findings to the commission this morning. Your architectural license is safe because we included a sworn affidavit stating you were actively defrauded by your father-in-law and had no knowledge of the toxic dumping. We protected your license. Jamal let out a ragged breath, covering his face with his hands. He was safe from prison, but his trust in his wife's family was annihilated. Richard, however, was not safe. He stared at me with pure terror in his eyes, realizing I had single-handedly dismantled his entire escape route. You turned me into the Planning Commission, Richard choked out. I am a corporate investor, Richard, I replied smoothly. I do thorough due diligence before I acquire an asset. When my environmental team discovered the toxic waste, we were legally obligated to report it. You should be thanking me. I just saved Vanguard Holdings $15 million. Madison jumped up, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. You set us up. You lured us here just to humiliate us and destroy us. You never intended to buy the land. You just wanted revenge for that stupid camping trip. I stood up slowly, matching her aggressive energy, but maintaining my absolute terrifying calm. I never let personal revenge interfere with good business, Madison, I said, walking around the table until I was standing just a few feet away from her. I brought you here because I am still going to buy Bear Creek. I am still going to acquire your company. I am just not going to pay $15 million for a toxic liability. I signaled my assistant, who handed me a single crisp sheet of paper. I dropped it on the table directly in front of Richard. This is my final offer, I announced. I will purchase the Bear Creek property and assume full liability for the EPA fines and the environmental cleanup costs. I will take the toxic burden off your hands so you do not go to federal prison for environmental neglect. In exchange, you will sign over the deed to Bear Creek and the controlling shares of your development firm to Vanguard Holdings. Richard looked at the document. His eyes bulged as he read the purchase price. $5 million! Richard gasped. You are offering $5 million for an entire development firm and 500 acres of land. We owe the bank $8 million. If we take this offer, we are still bankrupt. We will lose our house. I smiled, looking down at the man who had erased my existence to protect his reputation. Then I suggest you start packing, Richard. Because if you do not sign this document by 5 o'clock today, the bank will foreclose on your firm. The EPA will pursue criminal charges against you for the toxic dumping because you will not have the funds to clean it up. You will lose your house, your company, and your freedom. I tapped the paper with my index finger. $5 million, I whispered. Take it or go to prison. The choice is yours. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before Madison completely lost her mind. She slammed both of her hands flat against the glass table with a resounding smack. Her face was contorted with a kind of ugly, desperate rage that completely shattered her polished high society image. You cold-blooded psycho! Madison shrieked, her voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. You are a monster, Rebecca. You sit there in your expensive suit acting like you are better than us, but you are just a vindictive, ungrateful brat. We are your family. You owe us. I raised a single eyebrow, leaning comfortably against the high back of my leather chair. I owe you. That is a fascinating perspective, Madison. Please elaborate. You owe us for everything, Madison screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. We took care of you for 15 years. My parents put a roof over your head. They put food in your mouth. They clothed you and gave you an amazing life. You lived in a mansion, Rebecca. Most kids would kill for the lifestyle you had. You owe this family your very existence, and this is how you repay us. By extorting us for our company, by stealing our legacy right out from under us. You should be writing us a check for the full $15 million and thanking us on your knees. I let her finish her hysterical rant. I looked at Diane, who was sobbing silently into her hands. I looked at Richard, who was staring at the $5 million contract as if it were a venomous snake. Then I looked at Jamal. He was watching his wife with an expression of profound clinical disgust, as if he were seeing her true face for the very first time. I placed my hands flat on the desk and stood up. I walked slowly around the table until I was standing right next to Madison. She instinctively shrank back but tried to hold her ground, lifting her chin defiantly. Let us do some math, Madison, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational and deadly quiet tone. Let us calculate exactly how much I owe this family for my lavish upbringing. You claim I lived in a mansion. That is true. But my bedroom was the unheated storage space next to the laundry room. You claim your parents clothed me. Also true. I wore your discarded stained hand-me-downs while Diane bought you custom dresses for every country club event. You claim they fed me. I ate the leftovers after the rest of you finished your catered dinners. I stepped closer, forcing her to look into my eyes. You had private tutors, equestrian lessons, and a trust fund. I continued my words, striking her like physical blows. I had a public library card and a job washing dishes at a local diner when I was 12, just so I could buy my own winter coat. If we calculate the absolute bare minimum cost of the cheap calories and tap water your parents expended to keep me biologically alive for 15 years, I would generously estimate that figure at around $30,000. I tapped the $5 million contract, resting in front of Richard. I am offering you $5 million, I stated, my voice rising to command the entire room. That means I am overpaying my debt to this family by $4,970,000. I would say my account is settled in full. Madison opened her mouth to scream another insult, but no sound came out. She was suffocating on her own entitlement. You agreed to $15 million, Richard suddenly choked out. His hands hovered over the contract, trembling violently. Yesterday, your lawyer sent over a term sheet for $15 million. You cannot just slash $10 million off the price in one day. We need that money to pay off the bank. We need it to survive. I can do whatever I want, Richard, I replied, turning my attention to him. Yesterday, I was negotiating with a supposedly legitimate real estate developer who owned a pristine ecological site. Today, I am negotiating with a federal criminal who is trying to offload a highly toxic, hazardous waste dump. The market value has changed. $5 million is a gift. It is an act of sheer unwarranted charity. That is not enough, Diane wailed, burying her face in Richard's shoulder. Rebecca, please, we will lose the country club memberships. We will have to sell the cars. We will have to move into a normal house. We cannot live on what is left after the bank takes its share. We will be ruined. I looked at the diamond necklace glittering around Diane's throat and felt absolutely nothing. You should have thought about your country club memberships before you treated your youngest daughter like a disposable piece of trash, I replied coldly. You should have thought about your luxury cars before you buried industrial asbestos in a national forest. Your inability to maintain your fake wealthy lifestyle is not my problem. I glanced up at the large digital clock mounted on the boardroom wall. The red numbers glowed brightly, indicating it was exactly 3:30 in the afternoon. Let us talk about time, I announced, capturing everyone's attention. You have exactly 90 minutes before the banks close for the weekend. At precisely 5 o'clock, the bank holding your primary business loans will execute their foreclosure protocols. They will freeze every single asset tied to your name. Your personal accounts, your business accounts, your credit lines, everything will be locked. Richard swallowed hard, wiping the sweat from his brow. If that happens, I continued, pacing back to my chair. The bank seizes the development firm, but they will also discover the EPA indictment I submitted this morning. The bank will immediately wash their hands of the Bear Creek property because no financial institution wants to be tied to a federal environmental crime. Which means the property defaults back to you personally, Richard. You will be held personally and criminally liable for the $2.5 million fine and the $10 million cleanup. I sat down and crossed my legs, projecting absolute dominance. Without my $5 million buyout, you will not have a penny to pay those fines, I stated. The federal government will seize your mansion. They will seize Diane jewelry. They will auction off Madison designer shoes. And then they will put you in a federal penitentiary for environmental fraud. The silence in the room was absolute. The reality of their situation had finally crushed their arrogance. There was no more room for negotiation. There was no more room for manipulation. They were trapped in a corner entirely of their own making. You have two choices, I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the desk. Choice 1. You sign this contract right now. You take the $5 million. You hand over the firm and the toxic land to Vanguard Holdings. You walk away with a fraction of your wealth, but you avoid federal prison, and you get to keep whatever scraps of dignity you have left. I paused, letting the weight of the first option settle into their panicked minds. Choice 2. I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You walk out of that door. You try to call my bluff. And at 5 o'clock today, I will personally call my contacts at the Wall Street Journal and the Chicago Tribune. I will give them the exclusive story of how Richard, prominent real estate firm, has been illegally dumping toxic waste for years. I will destroy whatever is left of your public reputation before the authorities even show up to arrest you. Madison burst into tears, but this time there was no anger behind them, just pure, unadulterated fear. She looked at her father, her hands shaking. "Dad," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "Dad, you have to sign it. Please, I do not want to go to jail. I cannot go to jail. I will lose everything." Richard stared at this contract. The paper seemed to mock him. It was the physical manifestation of his complete and total failure as a businessman and as a human being. He slowly reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a gold fountain pen. His hand was shaking so badly he dropped the pen twice before he could finally grip it properly. Diane wept loudly, burying her face in her hands, mourning the loss of her social status. She did not look at me once. She was incapable of recognizing the damage she had caused. She only cared about the consequences she was about to suffer. Jamal sat perfectly still, watching the implosion of the family he had married into. He looked at the federal indictment, then at the $5 million contract, then at his weeping wife. His expression hardened into a mask of pure resolve. "You have 85 minutes left, Richard," I reminded him, checking the clock. "I highly recommend you start signing." Richard's shaking hand hovered over the signature line for what felt like an eternity. Then with a sudden violent motion, he threw the gold fountain pen across the room. It shattered against the far wall, splattering ink across the pristine white paint. He slammed both hands onto the glass table and pushed himself to his feet, his face twisted into a mask of desperate, furious defiance. "I won't do it!" Richard bellowed, his chest heaving. "I won't let you steal my company for pennies. You think you hold all the cards, Rebecca. You think because you wear a fancy suit and sit in this ridiculous glass tower that you've won. I built an empire. I am a respected man in this city." I didn't flinch. I just watched him unravel. "You're a cornered rat, Richard," I said coolly. "And you're out of time." "No, you're out of time," he shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You think I won't fight back? You think I'll just roll over and let you destroy us? If you force this foreclosure, if you ruin me, I will go straight to the press. I will tell everyone exactly who the ruthless CEO of Vanguard Holdings really is." He leaned over the table, his eyes wide and manic. "I will tell them that you are a vindictive, unstable daughter who orchestrated a hostile takeover to financially ruin her own flesh and blood. I will tell them that you are a monster who is perfectly willing to see her elderly parents thrown onto the street out of petty spite. How do you think your pristine corporate image will handle that, Rebecca? How will your investors react when they find out you use their money to settle family vendettas?" "Dad, stop," Jamal said, his voice tense, recognizing the danger of Richard's threat. "Shut up," Richard snapped, not breaking eye contact with me. "She needs to understand that she's destroying the family name. The name that gave her life. We are family, Rebecca. Blood is blood. You have a moral obligation to protect this family's honor, not drag it through the mud. You have the money. You have the power. You can fix this. You can pay off the bank, clean up the site, and save the company. It's what you should do. It's what a loyal daughter would do." He was using the oldest manipulation tactic in the book, weaponizing family loyalty and public perception. He was betting that I cared more about my corporate reputation than I cared about holding him accountable. He was betting that the scared little girl he had abandoned 18 years ago was still inside me, desperate for his approval. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my steepled fingers. "The family name," I repeated, letting out a short, sharp laugh. "You want to talk about the family name, Richard? You want to talk about honor?" I signaled to my lead attorney, who immediately opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the table toward me. I picked it up and held it in my hands. "Let's talk about how much you value family," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "Let's talk about the lengths you went to in order to protect that precious name 18 years ago." I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of documents. They were old, slightly yellowed at the edges, but the text was perfectly legible. "You threatened to go to the press, Richard," I continued, standing up and holding the papers out. "I highly encourage it, because if you do, I will hand them these." I tossed the documents onto the table. They landed next to the $5 million contract. "What is that?" Diane asked, her voice trembling, her eyes darting between me and the papers. That I said, my voice ringing with cold precision, is a certified copy of the police report filed by the park rangers 18 years ago. The report filed the night they found me half dead in Bear Creek. Richard's face drained of color. He stared at the papers as if they were radioactive. When the rangers found me, they immediately contacted the authorities. I explained, pacing slowly around the table. The police traced the license plate of the car that had been seen leaving the area. They traced it back to you, Richard. They called you at 3 in the morning to tell you they had found your daughter. I stopped pacing and looked directly at him. Do you remember what you told them, Richard? I asked. He didn't answer. He just stared at the table, his breathing shallow. You told them I was a troubled, rebellious teenager who had a history of running away, I said, my voice rising in volume. You told them I had stolen money from you, packed a bag, and snuck out of the house. You told them you had no idea I was in Bear Creek. You completely denied abandoning me. Madison gasped, putting a hand to her mouth. You lied to the police to protect yourself from child endangerment charges. I continued, the anger I had suppressed for 18 years finally bleeding into my voice. You painted me as a delinquent to save your own skin. You used your wealth and your influence to bury the investigation. And then when Child Protective Services got involved, you refused to take me back. You officially relinquished your parental rights, stating that I was beyond your control and a danger to your family. I walked back to my chair and sat down, staring at the terrified faces of the people who had destroyed my childhood. You didn't just abandon me in the woods, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You legally erased me. You threw me into the foster care system and washed your hands of me completely. All to protect the precious family name. I leaned forward, my eyes locked on Richard. So go ahead, Richard. Call the press. Tell them I'm a monster. Tell them I'm ruining the family. I will gladly give them the police reports, the CPS files, and the court transcripts. I will let the whole world know exactly what kind of man you are. We'll see whose reputation survives that. Richard collapsed into his chair, utterly defeated. The fight had completely left him. He looked old, broken, and pathetic. He knew he was trapped. He knew I held all the cards, and he knew I was not bluffing. For one brief second, he seemed ready to surrender. He reached for the contract, his hand shaking violently, but I placed my palm flat against the thick paper and slid it just out of his grasp. Not yet, Richard, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the boardroom. You do not get to just sign your name and walk away. Not before we finish reading. You threatened to tell the press about my ruthless character. I think we need to ensure you have all the facts straight before you make that call. I picked up the weathered police report from the table. The official seal of the state authorities was stamped on the top corner. I held it up so the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom illuminated the faded type. Let us look at page 3, I instructed, flipping the heavy parchment. This is the official transcript of the phone call between Officer Jenkins and Richard Williams at 3:45 in the morning. I was sitting in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in an aluminum thermal blanket. My core body temperature was 94 degrees. The paramedic was preparing to inject me with warm saline. And this is what my loving father said when the police informed him they had found his missing child. I cleared my throat, adopting a dry, clinical tone to read the official transcript. Officer states we have located a female minor matching your daughter's description. She is requiring emergency medical attention for severe hypothermia. Richard Williams responds she is a habitual runaway. We caught her stealing cash from my wallet earlier today. She packed a bag and fled the cabin while we were asleep. She is completely out of control and a danger to her mother and sister. We are terrified of her behavior and refuse to take her back into our home. Diane let out a sharp, strangled gasp and covered her ears. Stop it, Diane sobbed. Please stop reading. I will not stop, I snapped, slamming the report onto the glass table. You sat right next to him on the couch while he told that lie, Diane. The police report notes that a female voice in the background confirmed the statement. You actively participated in branding a freezing 15-year-old girl as a violent criminal thief. You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew that if you admitted to driving away and leaving me in a forest, you would be arrested for child abandonment and neglect. You would lose your precious company. You would lose your standing at the country club, so you sacrificed me to save yourselves. I walked behind Diana's chair. She shrank away from me as if my proximity caused her physical pain. Do you know what happens to a teenager when her wealthy parents officially sign documents claiming she is a violent, habitual runaway? I asked, my voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur right beside her ear. They do not send you to a nice foster family in the suburbs, Diane. They do not put you in a cozy bedroom with a warm family who wants to help you heal. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The city looked beautiful from up here, a grid of endless wealth and power. But I remembered what it looked like from the absolute bottom. They throw you into the high-security juvenile system, I stated, turning back to face them. They put you in institutional group homes, surrounded by chain-link fences and security guards. I spent the next 3 years sleeping on thin vinyl mattresses in rooms that smelled permanently of bleach and despair. I carried my few belongings in black plastic garbage bags every time they moved me to a new facility. I had to fight just to keep my shoes from being stolen. I had to fight to stay in high school, while the state social workers constantly told me I should just drop out and get a job at a fast food restaurant because kids with my specific psychological profile never amounted to anything. Richard was staring at the floor. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He looked completely hollowed out. I spent my 16th birthday locked in a juvenile holding facility because the state misplaced my paperwork. I continued relentlessly driving the narrative forward. I spent my 17th birthday working a night shift scrubbing toilets at a diner just so I could afford to buy a used math textbook. And all the while I knew that you were living in a 10,000 square foot mansion. I knew you were throwing lavish parties and buying Madison brand new sports cars. I shifted my gaze to my older sister. Madison was pressing herself as far back into her leather chair as physically possible. Her usual arrogant sneer was completely gone, replaced by wide-eyed terror. "And you, Madison?" I said, taking a step toward her. "You were 17 years old when you suggested they leave me in that forest. You were old enough to know exactly what could happen. You sat in that car and watched me begging in the rearview mirror. And when the police called, you did not say a word. You let them paint me as a monster because it meant you finally had all of their attention and all of their money entirely to yourself." "I was just a kid," Madison stammered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "I did not know they would actually leave you there forever. I thought they were just trying to scare you. I did not know they signed papers." "You knew," Jamal interrupted. Everyone turned to look at Jamal. The architect was sitting perfectly rigid, his hands folded tightly on the table. He was staring at Madison with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. It was the look of a man who suddenly realized he was married to a sociopath. "You told me your sister died," Jamal said, his voice low and vibrating with absolute disgust. "When we first started dating, I asked about the empty bed in the old family photos. You looked me right in the eye and told me your younger sister died of a tragic childhood illness. You cried, Madison. You actually squeezed out tears and let me hold you while you mourned a girl you deliberately left to die in the woods." Madison reached out toward him, her hand trembling. "Jamal, please, baby. You have to understand. My parents told me to say that. It was to protect the family business. It was just a story." Jamal swatted her hand away as if it were coated in poison. He stood up from his chair, pushing it back with a loud scrape against the floor. "Do not touch me," Jamal warned, his eyes blazing. "Do not ever touch me again." He turned his attention to Richard and Diane. "I spent 5 years breaking my back to keep this company afloat," Jamal stated, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. "I worked 80-hour weeks. I sacrificed my own health to design sustainable projects that would repair the damaged reputation of this firm. I thought I was helping a good family recover from a string of bad luck. I thought I was building a legacy for my future children, but you are not a family. You are a criminal enterprise. You are parasites." Jamal looked at the federal EPA indictment resting on the table and then back at Richard. "You forged my architectural license to cover up a toxic waste dump," Jamal said. You abandoned your own daughter to freeze to death to save your country club memberships, and you expected me to use my mother's hard-earned teacher retirement fund to bail you out of this foreclosure. Jamal let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. You people are disgusting, Jamal declared. You deserve every single thing Rebecca is about to do to you. Richard looked up, his face a mask of panic. Jamal, you cannot walk away. You are the lead architect. If you leave, the bank will know the firm is completely insolvent. You are contractually obligated to stay. Sue me, Jamal shot back instantly. Take me to court, Richard. Let us get everything on the public record. Let us put the forged soil reports and the child abandonment right into the public court transcripts. I would love to testify. Richard slumped back in his chair, the last remaining bit of fight draining out of his body. He was completely trapped, and he knew it. Every single exit route had been methodically blocked and locked by the very daughter he had thrown away. I walked back to the head of the table and slid the $5 million contract directly in front of Richard. I uncapped a sleek black pen and placed it gently on top of the document. We are done talking, I announced, my voice devoid of any emotion. You have exactly 45 minutes until the bank seizes everything. Sign the paper, Richard. Sign away your company. Sign away your toxic land. Sign away your entire life. I leaned in close, resting my hands on the table, staring him down with the weight of 18 years of vengeance. Or do not sign it, I whispered, and watch me let you drown. Richard stared at the pen. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like the glass walls might shatter from the pressure. He looked at the contract, then at me, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. He was a man completely out of options, standing on the absolute edge of the abyss. But before he could reach a trembling hand toward the pen, it was not Richard who broke. It was Madison. The reality of losing her luxurious lifestyle finally snapped the last remaining threads of Madison's sanity. She lunged forward, slamming her hands on the table, and aimed all of her terror directly at me. You are doing this to destroy me! Madison screamed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. You have always been jealous of me, Rebecca. Even when we were kids, you hated that Mom and Dad loved me more. You hated that I was popular, and you were just this awkward, weird little burden who ruined everything for us. I did not move a muscle. I simply let her dig her own grave deeper. You ruined that vacation. Madison wailed, tears of pure selfish rage streaming down her face. We were supposed to have a perfect family trip to the cabin, but you just sulked the entire time. You complained about the hiking. You complained about the cold. You embarrassed us in front of the other families at the lodge. You were so difficult and so impossible to love. Mom and Dad were stressed out of their minds because of you. We just wanted 5 minutes of peace. Leaving you on that road was supposed to teach you a lesson about being grateful. It is your own fault you got lost. If you were not such a miserable, annoying brat, we never would have left you there in the first place. I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her victim-blaming echo through the boardroom. She was 35 years old, and she was still trying to justify attempted murder because she found her younger sister annoying on a camping trip. Listen to yourself, Madison, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. You are standing in a corporate boardroom facing federal indictments and bankruptcy, and you are still trying to argue that a 15-year-old girl deserved to freeze to death because she did not smile enough on a family vacation. Your delusion is truly a medical marvel. Madison ignored me completely. Her panic was blinding her to reality. She frantically turned away from me and lunged toward her husband, grabbing him by the lapels of his tailored suit jacket. Jamal, we do not need her, Madison babbled, her eyes wide and manic. We do not need her dirty money or her hostile takeover. We can fix this ourselves. We can stall the bank. We just need enough liquid cash to pay the immediate arrears and hire a defense attorney to fight the EPA injunction. Call your mother, Jamal. Jamal froze. He looked down at his wife's hands clutching his jacket and then slowly looked up at her face. The disgust in his eyes was absolute. Excuse me, Jamal asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Call Beatrice, Madison demanded, shaking his lapels as if trying to physically rattle the money out of him. She has her pension. She taught in the Chicago public school system for 40 years. She has that massive retirement account and the life insurance payout from when your father died. She has hundreds of thousands of dollars just sitting in mutual funds. Tell her we need it. Tell her it is an absolute emergency to save the business. If we combine her retirement money with selling some of my jewelry and the cars, we can hold off the foreclosure. We can save the company. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I leaned back in my executive chair, crossing my arms and watching the final destruction of their marriage unfold. I did not even need to speak. Madison was doing all the work for me. Jamal reached up and clamped his large hands over Madison's wrists. With a slow, deliberate force, he peeled her manicured fingers off his suit jacket and pushed her hands away. He took a deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between himself and the woman he had married. "You want me to call my mother Jamal?" asked, every word heavy with a lethal, seething anger. "You want me to call a 70-year-old African-American woman who worked double shifts in underfunded South Side schools for 4 decades, a woman who graded papers until 2 in the morning, who bought school supplies for her students out of her own pocket, who scrimped and saved every single penny she ever earned, so she would not be a burden to anyone in her old age?" "Yes," Madison cried, completely oblivious to the danger in his tone. "We are family, Jamal. Families help each other in times of crisis. We elevated you. My dad made you the lead architect of this firm. We gave you this life. You owe us. Tell Beatrice she has to transfer the funds today." Jamal let out a sound that was half laugh and half snarl. It was a terrifying sound. "You elevated me," Jamal repeated, his voice rising in volume until it commanded the entire room. "I graduated at the top of my class at Cornell. I brought 3 award-winning sustainable design patents to this firm. I am the only reason your father's corrupt, decaying business lasted this long. I elevated you, Madison. And now you have the absolute, unmitigated gall to demand that my mother empty her life savings to bail out your father's criminal enterprise. It is a loan," Madison pleaded, her voice growing shrill as she realized he was rejecting her. "We will pay her back with interest once we develop the eco-resort." "There is no eco-resort," Jamal roared, pointing at the red EPA folder on the table. "It is a toxic waste dump. Your father forged my license to cover up environmental terrorism. If I ask my mother to put her pension into this firm, the federal government will seize it the second the EPA initiates their asset forfeiture protocols. You are asking me to throw my mother's survival money into a burning building just to keep your country club membership active for 1 more month. We will lose the house," Jamal, Diane suddenly wailed from the other side of the table, joining her daughter in the chorus of entitlement. "We will have nowhere to go. Beatrice has a fully paid-off house. She does not need all that cash sitting in the bank. We need it to survive." Jamal turned to look at Diane, his expression hardening into pure granite. "My mother money is clean," Jamal stated, his words slicing through their pathetic whining. "Her money was earned through decades of honest, grueling labor. She faced systemic hurdles you privileged parasites cannot even begin to comprehend. She fought for everything she has. And I would rather cut off my own right hand than let a single dime of her hard-earned pension fall into this toxic sinkhole you call a family business." "You are betraying us!" Madison screamed, stomping her foot on the floor like a petulant toddler. "You took vows, Jamal. For better or for worse. We are in the worst right now, and you are abandoning your wife. You are just like her." She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You are a disloyal traitor." The vows were built on a lie. Madison Jamal fired back, stepping completely away from her and aligning himself physically closer to my side of the room. "You lied to me about your sister. You lied to me about your family history. Your father lied to me about the very ground we were building on. There is no marriage left to betray. You destroyed it the moment you decided to use my name to cover up a felony." Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He did not look at Madison anymore. He looked at me. "Ms. Williams," Jamal said, his voice returning to a steady professional cadence. "Is your $5 million offer contingent on my continued employment as lead architect under Vanguard Holdings? Because if it is, I need to inform you that I am resigning from this firm effective immediately. I will not be associated with Richard or Madison for another second." I looked at Jamal, evaluating the absolute integrity of the man standing before me. He was willing to walk away from a lucrative career rather than compromise his morals or endanger his mother. He was exactly the kind of person I needed running my new sustainable development division. My offer for the firm is not contingent on your employment, Jamal, I replied, offering him a respectful nod. In fact, I highly encourage you to resign from their company right now. It is the smartest financial decision you could possibly make today. Jamal nodded firmly. Then I am out. He turned to Richard, who was still staring at the contract in a state of catatonic shock. I will be submitting my formal resignation to HR before 5 o'clock. I will also be retaining my own legal counsel to cooperate fully with the EPA investigation regarding the forged soil reports. You are on your own, Richard. Madison collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her arms and sobbing uncontrollably. The reality was finally setting in. There was no magical rescue. There was no secret fund to exploit. Her husband had rejected her. Her family was ruined. The golden child had finally hit rock bottom. I checked the digital clock on the wall. The red numbers glared down at us. You have 50 minutes left, Richard, I announced, my voice slicing through Madison, loud weeping. Jamal is gone. The pension fund is off the table. The bank is waiting. Are you going to sign the paper, or are we going to let the clock run out? Richard stared at the pen lying on the glass table. His hand hovered over it, trembling violently. He looked at his weeping wife and his hysterical daughter. He was a broken man, completely stripped of his arrogance and his fake high society armor. I watched them squirm in their expensive clothes. It was almost too easy. They were acting exactly like the desperate trapped animals I knew they would become. But I wanted to see just how deep their moral bankruptcy truly went. I wanted to see if the golden child was really untouchable when the family survival was placed on the line. I raised my right hand, signaling my lead attorney once again. He immediately reached into his leather briefcase and produced a single, pristine rectangle of heavy stock paper. He handed it to me with a crisp nod. I held it up so the harsh fluorescent light caught the official bank watermark. It was a certified cashier check drawn directly from Vanguard Holdings' primary operating account. $10 million, I stated, letting the massive number echo against the glass walls of the cavernous boardroom. I am holding a certified check for $10 million. It is completely liquid. You can walk out of this building right now, deposit this into your corporate account, and clear the immediate bank foreclosure before 5 o'clock. You will still lose the toxic Bear Creek land, but you will have enough capital to pay off the EPA fines, keep your firm afloat, and save your suburban mansion from federal seizure. Richard's head snapped up so fast I thought his neck might break. Diane stopped crying instantly, her tear-streaked face suddenly illuminated by the blinding light of unadulterated greed. Madison stopped her hysterical sobbing, wiping her nose with the back of her trembling hand. $10 million was pure salvation. It was their miraculous get-out-of-jail-free card. I lowered the check and placed it flat on the glass table directly next to the original $5 million buyout contract. However, I continued, my voice dropping into a deadly calm register that commanded absolute silence. This $10 million check comes with a very specific set of conditions. A final transaction to settle the emotional debts of this family once and for all. I signaled my attorney again. He produced a second document. It was a single page thick with legal jargon and absolute finality. He placed it carefully on the glass next to the $10 million check. This document is a voluntary renunciation of inheritance, I explained, pointing to the blank signature line at the bottom of the page. It legally severs all rights, claims, and future entitlements to any assets, trusts, or holdings associated with Richard and Diane estate. It specifically names Madison as the sole signee. I looked directly at my older sister, locking my eyes onto hers. If you want the $10 million, Richard, here is what has to happen, I announced. Madison is going to stand up from that chair. She is going to walk around to my side of the table. She is going to get down on both of her knees on this carpet. She is going to look me directly in the eyes, and she is going to apologize for leaving a 15-year-old girl to freeze to death in the woods. And then she is going to sign this document, permanently giving up every single penny of her inheritance. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. Madison screamed that she would never do it. She called me a psychopath. She slammed her hands against her chair, yelling that I was a sick, twisted monster trying to humiliate her for no reason. She looked to her parents, expecting them to fiercely defend her just as they always had. She expected Richard to throw the check back in my face and protect his favorite daughter, Honor. She expected Diane to wrap her in a protective maternal embrace and tell her she did not have to degrade herself for a street rat like me. But that is not what happened. The silence from Richard and Diane was completely deafening. They were not looking at Madison with protective love. They were staring at the $10 million check with a hungry, desperate intensity. The beautiful golden child was suddenly entirely expendable when the alternative was federal prison and abject poverty. Mom. Madison whispered, her voice trembling with sudden, horrifying realization. Dad, tell her no. Tell her I am not doing this. I am not getting on my knees for her. Richard swallowed hard. His Adam apple bobbed in his throat. He looked up at the digital clock on the wall. 42 minutes left until the bank seized his entire life. He turned slowly to look at his favorite daughter, Madison. Richard croaked, his voice strained and gravelly. It is $10 million. It saves the house. It keeps me out of federal prison. We need that money to survive. Madison stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the glass table. Her eyes were wide with pure betrayal. You cannot be serious. You want me to get on my knees and beg her for money. You want me to sign away my entire future. Diane stepped forward, grabbing Madison's arm. Her grip was tight, frantic, and bruising. Listen to your father, Madison. Do you want us to be homeless? Do you want your father to be locked in a cage? You owe us this. We gave you everything you ever wanted. We bought you luxury cars and diamond jewelry and paid for your lavish wedding. Now it is your turn to save this family. Just get on your knees and apologize. It is just words. It does not mean anything. I sat back in my executive chair, crossing my arms and watching the magnificent spectacle unfold. The delicious irony of the situation was intoxicating. The golden child was finally learning exactly what conditional love felt like. She was learning that her parents' affection was always tied entirely to her utility. When she was the beautiful trophy daughter they could parade around the country club, they worshipped her. Now that her profound humiliation was the literal currency required to save their own skins, they were throwing her directly under the bus without a single second thought. I will not do it! Madison shrieked, trying to violently pull her arm out of Diane's tight grasp. Jamal left me. I have nothing. If I sign away my inheritance, I will be totally broke. I will not have a single dime to my name. I will be ruined. Richard lost his temper entirely. The polished, wealthy patriarch vanished completely, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal willing to eat its own young to survive. You selfish, ungrateful brat! Richard bellowed, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. I am looking at a federal indictment. We are losing the entire company. You will not have an inheritance anyway if we go bankrupt today. There will be nothing left to inherit. Stop being a spoiled child and sign the damn paper right now. 35 minutes, I announced loudly, checking the slim silver watch on my wrist. I picked up the $10 million check and held it casually between my index and middle fingers, tapping it lightly against the desk. The offer expires the second that clock hits 4 o'clock. If Madison is not on her knees by then, I am taking this check back and you are permanently stuck with the $5 million toxic asset buyout. Decide quickly. Madison looked wildly around the room, breathing in short, frantic gasps. Her husband Jamal was standing near the door, his arms crossed, watching her with absolute cold detachment. He was not going to step in and save her. Her father was glaring at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. Her mother was digging her fingernails into her arm, crying and begging her to submit to the humiliation. She had absolutely no one. The privileged, protective bubble she had lived inside for 35 years had just violently popped, leaving her completely exposed to the harsh, brutal reality of the real world. The tension in the boardroom was suffocating. I watched closely and saw the exact moment Madison's spirit finally broke. The rigid, arrogant fight drained entirely out of her posture. Her shoulders slumped forward in defeat. The realization that she was utterly alone and completely powerless finally set into her privileged mind. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of venomous hatred and absolute terror. She was terrified of poverty. She was terrified of losing her parents' financial backing, even if that backing was currently just a fragile illusion. She took a shaky, hesitant step forward, moving around the edge of the massive glass table toward my chair. Every click of her expensive designer heels on the hardwood floor echoed through the silent boardroom, like a gavel striking a sound block. It was the sound of a privileged, sheltered ego taking its final death march. Madison looked back over her shoulder at our parents, hoping for a last-minute reprieve, hoping that the people who had shielded her from consequences her entire life would suddenly intervene. But Diane just pointed a rigid, shaking finger at the floor next to me. "Do it," Diane mouthed, her eyes wide with panic. "We need the money, Madison." Madison turned back toward me. Her face was a horrific mask of smeared expensive makeup and pure venomous resentment. She reached the space directly beside my executive chair. The physical act of bending her knees seemed to require tearing her own soul apart. She grabbed the edge of the heavy glass table, her knuckles turning white as she tried to brace herself against the inevitable. "On the floor, Madison," I commanded, my voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Both knees." She let out a ragged, suffocating sob. First her right knee hit the carpet, then her left. The fabric of her tailored skirt pulled uncomfortably tight as she dropped. She was kneeling before me. The golden child, the untouchable princess of the family, was literally on the floor at my feet. "Look at me," I ordered. She raised her head slowly. Her eyes were bloodshot, tearing tracks through her foundation. The hatred radiating from her was palpable, a toxic, burning rage that she could barely contain. She looked like she wanted to reach up and wrap her hands around my throat, but the $10 million check resting on the table kept her completely paralyzed in her submission. "Say it!" Richard barked from the other side of the room, his eyes frantically darting to the red digital clock on the wall. "Say it right now, Madison. We only have 38 minutes left until the bank closes." "I am sorry," Madison choked out. Her voice was barely a raspy whisper, strained and tight. "I am sorry we left you." I leaned forward in my leather chair, shaking my head slowly. "That is not what I asked for," I said, my tone clinical and detached. "I want the exact words. You need to own exactly what you did to me. Say it clearly so every single person in this room hears you." Madison clenched her fists so hard I could see her manicured nails biting deep into her own palms. Her chest heaved as she took a jagged, shaking breath. "I am sorry," she started again, her voice trembling violently with suppressed fury. "I am sorry that I suggested we leave a 15-year-old girl in the woods. I am sorry that I let you freeze in the dark. I am sorry that I lied to the police and let them put you in the foster system so I could have Mom and Dad all to myself." The words hung in the sterile air of the high-rise boardroom. Hearing her actually admit it out loud after 18 years of gaslighting and complete denial sent a profound wave of closure rushing through my chest. The terrified, abandoned 15-year-old girl inside my memory finally received her validation. It did not erase the trauma, but it absolutely vindicated my survival. "Say you meant it?" I pushed further, twisting the psychological knife deeper into her pride. "Say you knew exactly what you were doing when you watched me begging in the rearview mirror." "I knew what I was doing." Madison sobbed, venom dripping from every single syllable she forced out of her mouth. "I wanted you gone. I hated you. You were a burden. Are you happy now, Rebecca? Are you satisfied?" "I am getting there," I replied, smoothing an invisible crease from my Armani trousers. I picked up the heavy stock document, the voluntary renunciation of inheritance, and slid it to the edge of the glass table right above her bowed head. I picked up the sleek black fountain pen and held it out toward her. "Sign it," I ordered. Madison slowly stood up, her legs visibly shaking from the adrenaline and the humiliation. She looked down at the legal document. This single piece of paper represented the absolute death of her entire identity. Her entire life had been built on the promise of this family wealth. Without the company money, without the trust funds and the inheritance, she was absolutely nothing. She had no actual job skills, no genuine work ethic, and as of 10 minutes ago, no husband to support her. "Sign the damn paper," Madison Richard yelled, slamming his hand against the glass. "We are running out of time. Sign it so we can save the house." Madison snatched the pen from my hand. Her fingers were trembling so severely she could barely hold the instrument steady. She looked across the table at Diane one last time, her face twisted in pure agony. "You are making me do this," Madison cried out, her voice shattering. "You are letting her take everything from me. You are sacrificing me. It is to save the family." Diane pleaded, stepping forward and pressing her hands together. "We will make it up to you, sweetheart. I promise we will figure something out. Just sign it so we can deposit the check and stop the foreclosure. Please, baby." Madison turned back to the table. With a ragged, furious scream, she pressed the pen to the heavy paper. She signed her name on the dotted line, her signature messy and jagged, betraying her absolute rage. The moment the ink set into the paper, her status as the wealthy corporate heiress was officially terminated forever. She threw the pen with all her might. It bounced off my shoulder, but I did not even blink. I just sat there staring at her with cold, terrifying indifference. "I hate you," Madison screamed, her face inches from mine, her breath hot and frantic. "I hope you rot in hell, Rebecca." "I already did," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair, and I clawed my way out. "Welcome to your turn." Madison let out a guttural, animalistic cry. She turned on her heels and bolted toward the heavy oak boardroom doors. She ran past Jamal, who was still standing near the exit. Jamal did not flinch. He did not reach out to comfort her. He simply stepped aside and let his soon-to-be ex-wife flee into the hallway. Her loud, hysterical sobs echoed down the long corporate corridor until the heavy oak doors swung shut behind her, sealing her out of the room completely. The boardroom was suddenly very quiet. I looked down at the signed document. It was perfectly executed. I slid it over to my lead attorney. He inspected the signature meticulously, verifying the legal validity before nodding in confirmation and slipping it securely into his leather briefcase. The trap had firmly snapped shut. Richard let out a massive, explosive sigh of relief. He wiped his sweaty face with both of his hands and practically lunged across the glass table toward the $10 million cashier check. "It is done," Richard panted. His eyes locked hungrily on the money. She apologized. She signed the renunciation. "The deal is complete. Give me the check, Rebecca. I need to call the bank manager right now to wire the funds and stop the foreclosure before the deadline." Diane rushed to Richard's side, her eyes gleaming with renewed, arrogant greed. Now that the money was within physical reach, her fake maternal act vanished entirely. "You really are a cruel, vindictive girl," Diane snapped, glaring at me as she adjusted her diamond necklace, trying to regain her wealthy socialite posture. "To force your own sister to humiliate herself like that. It is completely sick. You need serious psychiatric help. But we have the money now. You cannot hold this over our heads anymore. We fulfilled your twisted little demands." I looked at the two of them. They were standing there shoulder to shoulder, fully believing they had outsmarted me. They believed they had survived the storm. They genuinely believed they were about to walk out of this building, pay off their debts, and return to their lavish country club lifestyle, leaving Madison to deal with the permanent financial fallout alone. I reached out and picked up the $10 million check. It felt light in my hands, a simple piece of paper representing ultimate leverage. I looked at Richard, whose hand was outstretched eagerly, waiting for me to hand him his salvation. I held the check just an inch past his trembling fingertips. The silence was thick. I slowly released my grip. Richard snatched the paper so fast the sharp edge nearly gave me a paper cut. He pulled it to his chest, clutching it like a physical shield against his impending ruin. He stared at the amount, the 10 followed by 6 zeros, and let out a breathless, manic laugh. The second the check was secure in his hands, the desperate cornered animal vanished entirely. The arrogant, untouchable real estate magnate returned instantly. He stood up straight, straightening his tie and adjusting his suit jacket. Diane mirrored his posture, wiping away her fake tears and lifting her chin with that familiar aristocratic superiority. They had what they wanted. The transaction was complete. Madison was gone, her inheritance surrendered, and they were rich again. Richard looked down at me, his eyes narrowing with deep, vicious contempt. "You really thought you could break us, Rebecca?" Richard sneered, shaking the check at me. "You thought all your money and your fancy lawyers could tear down what I built. We are walking out of here. We are going to pay off the bank. We are going to fix the EPA issue. And then we are going to pretend this miserable little meeting never happened. You will always be the ungrateful burden we left behind. All you did today was prove we were right to abandon you." Diane chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. "Enjoy your empty glass tower, Rebecca. You have no family. You have no one. We have our company and we have our lives." Richard turned on his heel, marching toward the heavy oak doors with absolute triumph. Diane followed right beside him, her designer heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. They were literally strutting out of my boardroom, completely convinced they had won the ultimate victory. They thought they had outsmarted the system, outsmarted the government, and outsmarted me. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my chair. I simply gave a slight nod to my lead attorney standing to my right. "You can certainly try to deposit that check, Richard," I called out, projecting my voice clearly across the large room. "It is a certified cashier check. The funds are absolutely guaranteed by Vanguard Holdings. It is perfectly valid legal tender." Richard stopped halfway to the door. He did not turn around, but his shoulders tensed. "But you are going to have a very hard time clearing those funds before the 5 o'clock deadline." I continued checking my silver watch. "In fact, you are going to have a hard time depositing it at all. Because a check is only useful if you actually have a functional bank account to put it into." Richard slowly turned around, his face dropping back into that gray, sickly hue. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, clutching the check tighter. "My corporate accounts are active. The foreclosure does not trigger for another 20 minutes. I smiled, folding my hands on the glass table. "The bank foreclosure does not trigger for 20 minutes. That is correct. But the federal freeze initiated by the Environmental Protection Agency went into effect exactly 30 minutes ago." I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror. The smug confidence completely evaporated from his face, replaced by a creeping, paralyzing dread. Diane grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into his suit jacket. "When my legal team submitted the real soil reports to the City Planning Commission this morning, we did not just send them to the local zoning board," I explained methodically. "We sent a full dossier directly to the regional director of the EPA and the federal prosecutor office. We included Jamal's sworn affidavit proving you forged the documents. We included the massive remediation estimates. And most importantly, we included an emergency injunction request." My attorney stepped forward, reading from a legal document. "Under federal environmental protection laws, when a corporate entity is found to be actively concealing hazardous industrial waste on commercial property, the government can petition to immediately freeze all liquid assets associated with the offending corporation to prevent capital flight prior to remediation." They granted the injunction, Richard I stated, my voice ringing like a death knell. "The judge signed the order at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. The banking network processed the freeze at exactly 3 o'clock. Every single routing number, account number, and corporate credit line attached to your name, your firm, and your personal estate has been completely locked by the federal government." Richard scrambled for his phone. His hands were shaking so violently he dropped it on the carpet. He fell to his knees, scooping it up and dialing his bank manager with frantic, clumsy fingers. He put the phone on speaker, holding it up as it rang. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," he muttered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. A voice echoed from the phone speaker, crisp and unsympathetic. "Mr. Williams, I cannot speak to you. Our legal department has instructed us to terminate all communication. Your accounts are under federal hold." "Listen to me," Richard screamed into the phone, spit flying from his lips. "I have a certified check for $10 million. I can cover the arrears. I can cover the EPA fines. Just open the receiving account so I can initiate the wire transfer. Just give me 10 minutes. "I am sorry, Mr. Williams," the bank manager replied. "The accounts do not exist anymore. Any deposits will be automatically seized by the federal authorities. Do not call this branch again. The line went dead. The dial tone echoed in the silent boardroom, a sharp, continuous pitch, signaling the absolute end of his empire. Richard stared at the phone in his hand. He looked down at the $10 million check in his other hand. The piece of paper that represented his salvation just seconds ago was now entirely, completely, and utterly worthless. He could not deposit it. He could not cash it. He could not use it to pay the bank. He could not use it to save his house. He was holding a fortune that he was legally barred from touching. "You knew," Diane whispered, her voice hollow and terrifyingly quiet. "You knew the accounts were frozen before you even offered us the money. You knew we could not use the check." I looked at the woman who gave birth to me, who abandoned me, and who felt absolutely no remorse for any of it. I knew, I confirmed, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. I timed it perfectly. "I wanted you to feel exactly what it is like to have salvation dangled right in front of your face, only to have it ripped away at the very last second. Just like watching your parents' car drive away into the dark." I stood up and walked around the table, looking down at Richard, who was still kneeling on the floor. "You made Madison get on her knees," I whispered, the words cutting through the air like shattered glass. "You forced your favorite daughter to sign away her entire future, her entire identity, and her entire inheritance for a piece of paper you cannot even use. You sold out your golden child for absolutely nothing." Richard let out a sound that barely resembled a human voice. It was a guttural, hollow wail of pure agony. He dropped his phone and gripped his hair, pulling at the gray strands as the magnitude of what he had just done crashed down upon him. He had thrown away his most beloved daughter, permanently severing their relationship and destroying her life for a fake lifeline. Diane collapsed onto the floor next to him, burying her face in her hands. She was not crying for Madison. She was crying because she realized she was going to lose her mansion, her jewelry, and her country club friends. She was going to be the wife of a convicted felon, completely penniless and publicly disgraced. "I did not offer you a way out, Richard," I stated, looking down at the two pathetic figures cowering on my carpet. "I offered you a mirror. I gave you the opportunity to show exactly how greedy and heartless you truly are. And you did exactly what I knew you would do. You turned on each other the second your survival was threatened. You proved to everyone in this room that you have zero loyalty, zero honor, and zero love for anyone but yourselves." The digital clock on the wall shifted. It was exactly 4 o'clock. The bank foreclosure protocols were now fully locked in place. There was no reversing the damage. The corporate entity they had built their entire identity around was officially dead. I turned my back on them and walked back to my desk. My lead attorney began packing up the files, securing the signed renunciation document safely inside his briefcase. The trap had been executed flawlessly. Every single exit was sealed, and the federal authorities were likely already dispatching agents to their corporate headquarters to begin the seizure process. They had absolutely nothing left to fight with. Richard stared at the useless $10 million check in his hands. His knuckles were white. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the glass table. His breathing was ragged, but I could see the gears in his desperate mind turning. He was a survivor of the ruthless corporate world, and he was searching frantically for a loophole. Any loophole that would allow him to salvage his ego and his fortune. "You think you have won?" Richard rasped, his voice trembling, but attempting to sound defiant. "The EPA injunction freezes the liquid assets. I understand that. But physical assets are different. The bank will foreclose on the commercial properties, but I still hold the deed to the Bear Creek Woods free and clear under a separate corporate entity. Even with the toxic waste fines I can file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, I can restructure the firm. I can leverage the remaining equity in my personal estate to hire a ruthless defense team. You have crippled me, Rebecca, but you have not killed me." Diane looked up from the carpet, her mascara completely ruined. A tiny spark of hope ignited in her tear-filled eyes. "He is right," she sniffled, wiping her face with her trembling hands. "We still have the house. We still have the physical land. We can sell the art collections, the luxury cars, the offshore accounts. We can rebuild our lives. We do not need your money to survive this." I looked at my lead attorney. He did not smile, but there was a distinct gleam of professional satisfaction in his eyes. He reached into his briefcase one final time and pulled out a thick bound ledger. He placed it squarely on the table. The sound of the heavy book hitting the glass made Richard flinch. "Richard," I said, my voice soft and dangerously calm. "Do you honestly believe I would spend 2 entire years planning this acquisition and leave you with a single solitary loophole?" I walked back to the table and tapped the heavy leather-bound ledger. "Let us talk about your debt," I continued. "Over the last 24 months, your real estate development firm started bleeding cash. The industrial demolition contract was an absolute disaster. You were desperate for capital to keep up appearances, to keep paying for Diane Country Club dues and Madison lavish luxury lifestyle. So you started taking out massive high-interest commercial loans. You refinanced your failing commercial properties. You took out a massive second mortgage on your mansion. You thought you were dealing with a consortium of private offshore lenders who did not ask too many questions." Richard swallowed hard. "They were private equity groups. Standard mezzanine financing. It is completely legal and standard practice in this industry." "It is completely legal," I agreed, nodding slowly. "But what you did not know, Richard, is who actually owned those private equity groups. You were dealing with anonymous shell companies. Apex Capital Solutions, Horizon Trust, Blue Ridge Financial. Does any of that sound familiar to you?" Richard's eyes widened in sheer panic. He gripped the edge of the table, his fingernails scraping against the glass. "Those are my primary creditors. They hold the promissory notes on everything I own. Vanguard Holdings owns Apex Capital," I stated, my words dropping like heavy anvils onto the glass table. "Vanguard Holdings owns Horizon Trust. Vanguard Holdings owns Blue Ridge Financial. I did not just buy your company today, Richard. I have been buying your company piece by piece, debt by debt, for 2 solid years. I am your bank. I am your primary secured creditor. I own every single promissory note, every mortgage, and every line of credit tied to your entire family." Diane let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth. The fragile illusion of her safety net vanished entirely. The mansion she had been bragging about, the cars she drove, they all belonged to the daughter she abandoned. "But that is not even the best part," I said, leaning in closer to ensure Richard heard every single syllable. "You see, I know exactly how arrogant you are. I knew you would never admit to your family just how close to bankruptcy you really were. You needed cash fast, but your commercial properties were completely underwater. So you did something incredibly stupid and incredibly desperate behind your family back." I flipped open the heavy ledger and turned to a specific highlighted page. I pointed to a complex legal paragraph detailing a commercial loan agreement. "6 months ago, you took out a bridge loan for $12 million just to keep the firm afloat," I explained. "The lender required heavy collateral. Because your commercial portfolio was already leveraged to the maximum, you used the only unencumbered asset you had left. You used the Bear Creek Woods." Richard's face turned a sickly shade of gray. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. His entire body began to shake. "You cross-collateralized the Bear Creek Woods against the failing commercial loans," I declared, my voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. "You tied the destiny of your entire real estate empire directly to that forest. And you signed a standard acceleration clause." "Do you know what an acceleration clause is, Diane?" I turned to look at my mother, who was trembling violently on the floor. She shook her head, completely lost in the financial terminology, but fully understanding the tone of absolute doom in my voice. "It means that if Richard defaults on a single payment, or if a sudden catastrophic liability drastically devalues the collateral, the lender can immediately demand the entire loan balance be paid in full," I explained, breaking it down into agonizingly simple terms. "The EPA federal indictment for toxic dumping just devalued the Bear Creek Woods to negative $10 million. That is a catastrophic liability. It triggered the acceleration clause exactly 1 hour ago." I looked back at Richard. His chest was heaving. He knew exactly what was coming. "Because you cannot pay the $12 million loan balance today, I am legally executing my right as your primary secured creditor to repossess the collateral," I stated, pointing firmly at the ledger. "I am seizing the Bear Creek Woods." But because of your brilliant, arrogant decision to cross-collateralize the debt, the default cascades across your entire financial portfolio. I am not just seizing the forest. I am seizing the commercial properties. I am seizing your development firm. I am seizing the equity in your personal mansion. I am repossessing your entire life. Richard's legs finally gave out. He collapsed backward into his leather chair, staring blindly at the ceiling. The realization had completely broken his mind. There was no bankruptcy protection. There was no restructuring. He had handed the keys to his entire empire directly to the daughter he discarded like garbage. "You thought leaving me in those woods was a hilarious joke," I whispered, walking around the table until I was standing right in front of him. "You thought the forest was just a place to dispose of your unwanted burdens. You used it to dispose of toxic waste to save a few $1 million. You used it to dispose of me to save yourselves the inconvenience of raising me. But the forest kept me alive. And now, 18 years later, that exact same forest is the legal mechanism I am using to strip you of every single thing you value in this world." Diane began to weep hysterically, rocking back and forth on the carpet. She finally understood the sheer magnitude of the trap. They had absolutely nothing. The designer clothes they were currently wearing were essentially the only things they truly owned anymore. The country club, the social status, the wealthy friends, it was all gone, permanently erased by their own greed. "You wanted me to prove I could handle the wilderness," I said, looking down at my defeated, broken form. "I handled it perfectly, Richard. I learned how to hunt. I learned how to survive in a world filled with predators. The question is, how are you going to handle it now that you are the one who is completely stranded in the dark?" Before Richard could even attempt to formulate a pathetic response to my question, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom were violently shoved open. Madison stumbled back into the room, her appearance completely unhinged. She was clutching her cell phone in her trembling hand, her eyes wide with a fresh new wave of absolute terror. She had not managed to leave the building. She had barely made it to the executive lobby before her entire reality collapsed. "My cards are declining!" Madison screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the glass and steel room. She waved her phone frantically in the air. "I tried to book a hotel suite. I tried to order a private car. Every single black card I own is declining. The banking app says my accounts do not exist anymore. Not frozen. Deleted." She marched toward Richard, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him violently. "Dad, what is happening?" Madison wailed, her fingernails digging into his ruined suit. "Fix this. Call the wealth management team. You said the $10 million check would save us. You promised me." Richard was entirely unresponsive. He sat slumped in his chair, staring at the glass table with dead, empty eyes. He was completely broken, incapable of processing another single catastrophe. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my arms and watching the magnificent implosion. "He cannot fix it, Madison," I said, my voice calm and conversational, cutting through her frantic screaming. "Your wealth management team works for me now." Madison whipped her head around to glare at me, her face twisted in a mask of pure, desperate hatred. "What did you do to my accounts, you psycho? I signed your stupid paper. I gave up my inheritance. I did exactly what you wanted." I gave a slight nod to my lead attorney. He smoothly unlatched his briefcase and pulled out a photocopy of the exact document Madison had signed in her tears and humiliation just minutes prior. He slid it across the glass table until it came to rest directly in front of Richard and Madison. "I highly recommend you read the fine print of the documents you sign, Madison," I instructed, gesturing gracefully toward the paper. "Or better yet, perhaps your brilliant father should have read it before he forced you to your knees and commanded you to sign your life away." Richard slowly raised his head. His trembling hands reached out to pull the photocopy closer. His bloodshot eyes scanned the dense legal text. I watched his pupils dart back and forth across the paragraphs. I watched the exact millisecond his brain registered the true nature of the trap I had set. He let out a sharp, gasping wheeze, as if the air had been physically punched out of his lungs. "You," Richard choked out, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "You did not just make her renounce her inheritance." "No, Richard," I replied, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across my face. "I did not. I stood up and smoothed the lapels of my Armani suit, projecting absolute unyielding authority. 5 years ago, when your commercial real estate ventures first started taking on water, you did something very sneaky and very illegal, I explained, pacing slowly around the boardroom table. You wanted to protect your primary assets from potential commercial liability. You wanted to ensure that if your business went bankrupt, the bank could not touch your personal wealth. So you quietly transferred 51% of the controlling shares of the development firm, the title to the Bear Creek Woods, and the deed to your ultra-luxury Connecticut mansion directly into a private trust. I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my older sister. And you made Madison the sole legal proprietor of that trust, I stated. You put the entire kingdom in the name of your golden child to hide it from your creditors. You thought you were an absolute genius. You thought your fortune was entirely untouchable. Diane let out a loud, wretched sob from the floor, finally understanding the horrific magnitude of their vulnerability. The document I placed on this table was not just a voluntary renunciation of future inheritance. I continued, my voice ringing with lethal precision. It was a comprehensive deed in lieu of foreclosure combined with an absolute transfer of current holdings. When Madison signed her name on that dotted line, she did not just give up her future money. She legally transferred every single active share, every single property title, and every single asset held in her name directly to Vanguard Holdings to offset your catastrophic corporate debt. Madison's face drained of all color, turning a sickening, translucent shade of white. She looked down at the photocopy on the table, her eyes wide with total disbelief. "You stole it," Madison whispered, her voice trembling violently. "You stole the company. You stole my trust fund." "I did not steal anything, Madison," I fired back, my tone sharpening into a weapon. "You gave it to me. You willingly signed it over to your primary secured creditor to avoid a federal criminal indictment. And the best part is, I did not have to spend a single dime to acquire your empire." I walked back to my desk and picked up the voided $5 million contract and the useless $10 million cashier check. I tore them both directly in half and let the pieces flutter to the carpet. "I did not pay $15 million for your toxic wasteland," I announced. "I did not pay $10 million. I did not pay $5 million. I acquired your entire corporate portfolio, your pristine forest, and your sprawling suburban mansion for exactly $0. I legally confiscated it all as payment for your outstanding debts." Richard buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, agonizing moan of pure defeat. He had literally commanded his daughter to hand over the keys to his entire existence. In his blind, desperate greed for the $10 million check, he had forced Madison to sign the instrument of their total destruction. He had dug his own grave and jumped directly inside. "You tricked us!" Diane wailed from the carpet, her mascara running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "You are a wicked, evil girl. We are your family. Where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do tonight?" "That is entirely your problem, Diane," I said, stepping over the torn pieces of the checks. "Because as of this exact moment, you are legally trespassing on Vanguard Holdings property. You do not own the company cars parked in the executive garage downstairs. You do not own the expensive artwork hanging on the walls of your home. You do not even own the beds you sleep in." I picked up my desk phone and pressed a single button connecting directly to the building security office. "Yes, this is the CEO." I spoke clearly into the receiver. "Please send a full security detail up to the 50th floor boardroom. We have 3 unauthorized individuals trespassing in the executive suite. I need them escorted out of the building and physically removed from the premises immediately." I hung up the phone and looked down at the shattered remnants of my biological family. They were completely stripped of their wealth, their power, and their arrogant dignity. They had absolutely nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the terrifying reality of their impending federal investigation. "The Bear Creek Woods belong to me now," I stated, delivering the final crushing verdict. "And unlike you, I actually know how to protect what is mine. You have exactly 2 minutes to gather your things before my security team drags you out by your designer collars. I highly suggest you start walking." The heavy oak doors of the boardroom remained wide open, framing the hallway where Madison had just tried to flee. She stood frozen, looking back at the sterile glass room that had become her tomb. She turned her desperate, bloodshot eyes toward the only person left who had not been entirely destroyed by my trap. Jamal. Madison gasped, reaching out a trembling hand toward her husband. Jamal, we have to fight this. We have to sue her. Call your mother. We need that pension money right now to hire a defense team. You have to save me. Jamal did not move to comfort her. He did not offer a reassuring embrace. He stood perfectly rigid, staring at her as if she were a rotting corpse. He had watched this entire display unfold. He had watched her parents leverage her life to save their own. He had watched his wife willingly sacrifice her own dignity for a fraudulent paycheck. He slowly raised his left hand. He grasped the thick gold wedding band on his ring finger. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he slid the metal off his hand. He stepped forward and tossed it directly onto the glass table. The heavy gold ring bounced once, clattered loudly against the smooth surface, and came to a dead stop right next to the torn pieces of the $10 million check. "Save you!" Jamal repeated, his voice echoing with absolute bone-chilling disgust. "You want me to save a woman who smiled while her sister was left to freeze in a forest. You want me to bankrupt my mother to protect a family of corrupt, toxic parasites who used my architectural license to mask an environmental disaster." Madison stared at the gold ring on the table, her jaw trembling. "I am your wife," she whimpered, the arrogant princess reduced to a pathetic begging shell. "We took vows. Those vows were nullified the second I realized I was sleeping next to a sociopath," Jamal stated, his words cutting through her like a scalpel. "I am filing for divorce the moment I leave this building, Madison. I will not pay you a single cent in alimony because as of 10 minutes ago, you literally do not own a bank account to deposit it into. You have absolutely nothing, and you deserve exactly that." Diane tried to crawl forward on the carpet, lifting her tear-stained face. "Jamal, please." Diane wept. "You are part of this family. You cannot just abandon us." Jamal looked down at Diane with pure contempt. "I was never part of this family, Diane. I was a prop. I was a respectable, talented minority you could parade around your country club to prove how progressive you were, while behind closed doors you treated me like a glorified servant. You used my clean name to launder your filthy reputation. But that ends today." Jamal turned his attention back to me. He straightened his tie, the anger in his face smoothing out into sharp, clinical professionalism. "Ms. Williams," Jamal said, "as I stated earlier, my resignation from Richard Firm is absolute. But before I walk out of that door, I believe I have something that belongs to the new owner of the company." Jamal reached into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a small, encrypted black USB drive. He held it up, letting the harsh fluorescent lights catch the matte finish. Richard, who had been sitting in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly snapped his head up. His bloodshot eyes locked onto the black plastic drive. A fresh wave of sheer, absolute terror washed over his gray face. "Jamal," Richard rasped, holding out a shaking hand. "Jamal, whatever that is, do not give it to her. I am begging you." Jamal ignored his former boss completely. He walked around the table and stopped directly in front of my desk. He placed the USB drive gently on the mahogany surface. "I am an architect, not an accountant," Jamal explained, keeping his eyes locked on mine with profound respect. "But I am also not a fool. When the industrial demolition project started bleeding cash 6 months ago, Richard refused to let me see the vendor invoices. He became paranoid, locking the physical filing cabinets and restricting digital access to the executive servers. I knew something was fundamentally wrong. I knew he was hiding something that could eventually blow back on me." I leaned forward, my interest genuinely piqued. "What exactly did you find, Jamal?" "I hired an independent cybersecurity contractor to discreetly clone the executive servers." Jamal stated, his voice ringing loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I did it to protect myself, to ensure I had proof that I was isolated from the financial decisions if the company ever went under. What I found was much worse than I anticipated. He kept 2 sets of books." Diane let out a sharp, horrified shriek. Richard slammed his head down onto the glass table, defeated beyond all measure. "This drive contains the shadow ledger, detailing over a decade of systematic tax evasion." Jamal continued, relentlessly exposing the final layer of their corruption. Wire fraud, embezzlement, millions of dollars funneled through offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands to avoid IRS scrutiny. It details every single bribe he paid to city zoning inspectors, every corrupt official he bought off to fast-track his commercial permits, and the exact paper trail of how he siphoned the development firm operating capital into Diane's personal shopping accounts. Richard let out a muffled, agonizing groan against the glass table. He was not just facing EPA fines anymore. He was facing decades in federal prison for massive tax fraud. I plan to hand this over to the federal authorities if Richard ever tried to make me the fall guy for his impending bankruptcy, Jamal concluded, standing tall. But considering you are now the legal owner of the firm, and considering the sheer magnitude of what this family did to you, I believe this drive belongs in your hands. You will know exactly which federal prosecutor to send it to. I reached out and picked up the USB drive. It felt heavier than it looked. It was the absolute final nail in Richard's coffin. There was no escaping this. I looked up at Jamal, seeing a man who had survived the toxic wasteland of my family, with his integrity completely intact. "You are a very smart man, Jamal," I said, offering him a genuine appreciative smile. "You protected yourself beautifully. I will ensure this evidence goes directly to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division by tomorrow morning. They will be very interested in Richard's offshore activities." I slipped the drive into my pocket and stood up, extending my hand toward him. "When the dust settles on this demolition, my offer stands," I announced, shaking his hand firmly. "Vanguard Holdings needs a director of sustainable architecture, someone with your talent and your unshakable moral compass. My assistant will email you a compensation package next week. Take some time to get your mother settled, finalize your divorce, and then we will talk." Jamal nodded, a look of profound relief washing over his face. The nightmare was over for him. He had walked into this building facing ruin, and he was walking out with his freedom, his license, and a massive career upgrade. "Thank you, Ms. Williams," Jamal said. "I look forward to reviewing it." He turned on his heel and walked toward the exit. Madison, realizing that her absolute last lifeline was walking out the door, threw herself forward. She scrambled across the carpet, grabbing the cuff of Jamal's trousers. "Jamal, please!" Madison begged, tears and ruined mascara staining her face. "You cannot leave me here with them. You cannot leave me with nothing. I am your wife." Jamal looked down at her, his face completely blank. He firmly jerked his leg, pulling his trousers out of her desperate grip. "You have exactly what you deserve," Madison, Jamal said coldly. "Nothing." He stepped out into the hallway just as the elevator doors chimed open. 4 large, broad-shouldered security guards in sharp black suits stepped out into the executive lobby. They moved with military precision, bypassing Jamal and heading straight for the open doors of the boardroom. The final act had arrived. Jamal was free. The evidence of Richard's financial crimes was secured in my pocket, and the cleanup crew had officially arrived to take out the trash. The 4 security guards moved into the boardroom with the synchronized efficiency of a tactical unit. They were massive men dressed in tailored black suits with earpieces discreetly tucked into their collars. They fanned out, creating a physical barrier between my executive desk and the 3 shattered figures trespassing on my property. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting a calm but absolute authority over the chaos. "These individuals are no longer permitted on Vanguard Holdings property. They have been stripped of their corporate credentials and their assets have been legally seized. Please escort them out of the building. If they resist, you are authorized to use whatever force is necessary to remove them from the premises." The head of the security detail, a towering man named David, nodded firmly. He stepped forward, addressing Richard, who was still slumped over the glass table. Sir David said, his tone flat and professional. "You need to vacate the building immediately. Let us go." For a fraction of a second, the sheer reality of the physical eviction seemed to finally penetrate the wall of denial surrounding my biological family. The legal documents and the frozen bank accounts were abstract concepts they were still trying to wrap their minds around. But 4 heavily muscled security guards ordering them to leave was an immediate physical consequence. The spell broke. The catatonic shock evaporated, and pure, unadulterated primal rage violently took its place. Madison was the first to snap. The golden child had never been told no in her entire 35 years of existence. She had never been denied a privilege, never faced a consequence, and never been physically handled by anyone. Watching her husband walk out on her, and now being ordered out by security guards completely fractured her mind. "You cannot do this to me!" Madison shrieked, her voice tearing through her throat. "I am a VIP. I am the daughter of Richard Williams. You work for us. You are nothing but hired help." She spun around and locked her manic, bloodshot eyes on me. The venom in her gaze was absolute. She let out a guttural, terrifying scream and launched herself across the boardroom. She extended her hands, her manicured nails aimed directly at my face, intending to physically attack me. I did not even flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood behind my desk and watched her fly toward me. She did not make it past the edge of the glass table. Two security guards intercepted her instantly. One grabbed her outstretched arms while the other wrapped a thick, solid arm around her waist, lifting her completely off the carpet. Madison thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive designer heels in the air and screaming a string of vicious, incoherent curses. "Let me go!" Madison roared, spitting in the direction of the guards. "I will ruin you, Rebecca. You destroyed my life. You stole my husband. You stole my money. I will end you." Seeing his favorite daughter being physically restrained finally ignited the remaining embers of Richard's dying ego. The patriarch who had ruled his household through financial intimidation and emotional manipulation could not handle the sight of his own powerlessness. With a sudden burst of frantic energy, Richard shoved himself off the table. He grabbed the heavy leather chair he had been sitting in and hurled it recklessly toward the security detail before charging directly at me. "You ungrateful little parasite!" Richard bellowed, his face purple with absolute fury. "I gave you life. I should have made sure you never made it out of those woods." David intercepted Richard with brutal, swift precision. He stepped into Richard's path, grabbed him by the lapels of his ruined suit, and spun him around effortlessly. David slammed Richard face first against the glass wall of the boardroom, pinning the former real estate magnate against the transparent pane. Richard grunted in pain, his cheek smashed against the cold glass, his arms pinned firmly behind his back. Diane watched her husband and daughter being physically subdued and completely lost her mind. She scrambled backward on the carpet, clutching her designer handbag to her chest as if it were a life preserver. She began wailing frantically, begging the guards not to hurt them, while simultaneously shouting threats about lawsuits and police brutality. "Get them out of my sight," I ordered, my voice slicing through their pathetic screaming. The guards moved with ruthless efficiency. They did not care about designer suits or country club statuses. To them, these were just hostile trespassers refusing to comply with a direct eviction order. David wrenched Richard away from the glass, twisting his arm into a compliance hold that forced the older man to march forward toward the exit. Richard cursed and stumbled, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the hardwood floor. The two guards holding Madison practically carried her toward the door. She was thrashing so violently, her hair had completely come undone, falling into her tear-streaked face in a tangled, messy knot. She was weeping and screaming, alternating between begging for her money and threatening to ruin me. A fourth guard grabbed Diane firmly by the elbow, pulling her up from the carpet. Diane tried to yank her arm away, screaming about assault and battery, but the guard simply tightened his grip and marched her out right behind her husband and daughter. I stepped out from behind my desk and followed them out of the boardroom. I wanted to watch this. I wanted to witness every single second of their departure. I had waited 18 years for this exact moment, and I was not going to miss the grand finale. The security detail dragged my screaming, thrashing family down the long corporate hallway toward the private executive elevators. Employees from various departments peeked their heads out of their offices, drawn by the deafening commotion. Analysts, assistants, and junior executives watched in absolute stunned silence as the former owners of the development firm were frog-marched past them like common criminals. They reached the elevators and David shoved Richard inside. The other guards tossed Madison and Diane in right behind him. I stepped into the adjacent elevator, hitting the button for the main lobby. I wanted to be waiting for them at the bottom. The ride down to the ground floor took less than a minute. I stepped out of my elevator just as the doors to their elevator slid open. The Vanguard Holdings main lobby was a massive, sprawling atrium of white marble and soaring glass pillars. It was the absolute heart of the financial district. And at 4:15 on a Friday afternoon, it was packed. The timing could not have been more perfect. A highly anticipated commercial real estate summit had just concluded in our lower-level conference center. The lobby was overflowing with prominent investors, banking executives, and high-profile real estate developers. These were the exact people Richard had spent his entire life trying to impress. These were the men he played golf with, the men he borrowed money from, the men he lied to on a daily basis to maintain his fraudulent empire. The heavy steel elevator doors parted, and the security guards dragged my family out into the blinding light of the main atrium. Madison was still screaming, struggling against the guards. Grip, her voice echoing off the high marble ceilings. Richard was red-faced and sweating heavily, his expensive suit jacket torn at the shoulder, his tie askew. Diane was sobbing loudly. Her makeup completely ruined her expensive jewelry, looking absolutely ridiculous against her disheveled, panicked state. The entire lobby went completely dead silent. Over 200 highly influential business people stopped what they were doing and turned to look. Richard stumbled forward as David released his arm. He caught his balance and looked up. The color drained from his face instantly. He recognized the crowd. He saw the CEO of the bank that had just frozen his accounts. He saw the managing partners of the firms he had been trying to solicit for emergency bridge loans. He saw the very people he had spent decades convincing he was an untouchable titan of industry. Richard, Diane, and Madison stood frozen in the center of the vast marble lobby, completely surrounded by their peers. They were entirely exposed. Every single person in that room was watching them being escorted out by armed security like dangerous vagrants. "What is going on here?" a prominent investment banker asked, stepping forward and staring at Richard in absolute shock. "Richard, what is happening? Why are they handling you like this?" Richard opened his mouth, but he was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public humiliation. He had no lies left to spin. He had no excuses. He was standing in front of his entire professional network, utterly ruined. I stepped forward, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The crowd parted for me, instinctively recognizing the authority radiating from my posture. I walked until I was standing directly in front of my shattered family. "Allow me to clarify the situation, gentlemen," I announced, projecting my voice so it carried to every corner of the crowded lobby. "Richard Williams and his family are being permanently escorted from this building. Vanguard Holdings has formally acquired their entire development firm, their commercial portfolio, and all of their personal assets due to catastrophic financial default." Whispers erupted immediately across the lobby. Men in expensive suits leaned in to share the scandalous news. Cell phones were pulled out. People began recording the spectacle. Furthermore, I continued making sure every single person heard the final nail in the coffin. Richard Development Firm is currently under active federal investigation by the Environmental Protection Agency for illegal toxic dumping and massive corporate fraud. His accounts have been seized by the federal government. He is completely insolvent. The whispers turned into loud, shocked murmurs. The bankers and investors took a collective step backward, physically distancing themselves from Richard, as if his very presence was a contagious disease. In the corporate world, toxic waste and federal indictments were the ultimate plague. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near him. Richard looked around at the faces of his former peers. He saw the disgust, the judgment, and the absolute rejection in their eyes. The social currency he valued more than his own daughter had just crashed to zero. He had absolutely nothing left. He was a pariah. Diane tried to hide her face behind her designer handbag, but the damage was done. The other wealthy socialites in the room were already texting their friends, spreading the news of her catastrophic downfall. Madison looked at the cell phones recording her humiliation and let out one final pathetic sob. The golden child realized that her entire reputation was officially dead. She would never be invited to another gala. She would never be accepted back into her high society circles. She was officially a bankrupt laughingstock. "Get them out of my building," I instructed the security team, turning my back on them completely. The guards stepped forward, grabbing their arms one last time. They marched Richard, Diane, and Madison toward the massive revolving glass doors at the front of the lobby. They pushed them through the spinning glass, ejecting them forcefully onto the cold concrete of the Chicago sidewalk. The harsh winter wind immediately whipped around them. They stumbled on the pavement, holding themselves against the freezing air. They had no money. They had no credit cards. They had no cars waiting for them in the garage. They had no home to return to. They were entirely stranded in the cold, exactly like they had left me 18 years ago. I stood inside the warm, pristine lobby, separated from them by a thick pane of reinforced glass. I watched them shiver on the sidewalk. I watched them realize they were completely, entirely, and utterly destroyed. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt absolutely nothing but the profound, satisfying peace of absolute justice. 6 months had passed since that freezing Friday afternoon when I stood safely behind a wall of reinforced glass and watched my biological family huddle on the Chicago pavement. The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but when they finally lock into place, they grind everything to absolute dust. Richard and Diane were currently residing in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a decaying building on the far industrial outskirts of the city. It was a spectacular fall from grace. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division had meticulously ripped apart the encrypted USB drive Jamal left behind. The resulting federal indictments for massive tax evasion, wire fraud, and environmental terrorism had permanently grounded them. With Vanguard Holdings having lawfully seized all their physical and liquid assets, they could not even afford a private defense attorney. Richard was relying on an overworked public defender to negotiate a plea deal that would still likely see him spending the remainder of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. Diane had seemingly aged 20 years in the span of 6 months. The designer wardrobe had been completely confiscated by the government to pay down their massive tax arrears. Her country club friends had immediately blocked her number the second the news of the toxic dumping scandal broke in the local papers. She spent her days sitting in a drafty living room, staring at peeling wallpaper, completely isolated and utterly irrelevant. The wealthy socialite who had abandoned her own daughter for a luxury vacation was now rationing canned soup to survive the winter. They had absolutely no one left to manipulate and no money left to steal. Madison experienced a different but equally devastating kind of hell. The golden child was finally forced to enter the unforgiving reality of the real world. Jamal had executed a ruthless, hyper-efficient divorce. Because Madison had willingly signed away her entire trust fund and all her corporate holdings in my boardroom, she had absolutely zero financial leverage. She walked away from the marriage with nothing but a mountain of legal debt and a permanently tarnished reputation. The former heiress who once commanded luxury boutiques was now working 40 hours a week as a floor associate at a mid-tier retail outlet in a suburban mall. She spent her days folding sweaters, organizing shoe racks, and ringing up customers who used to attend her lavish holiday parties. Every time someone from her old life recognized her, she had to swallow her pride plaster on a fake retail smile and hand them their receipt. There was no safety net to catch her. There was no rich father to bail her out of her miserable shifts. The soft, delicate hands that had never worked a day in her life were now calloused and dry from breaking down cardboard boxes in the stockroom. She was surviving on minimum wage, exactly like the working-class people she had spent her entire privileged life mocking. I did not waste my time gloating over their misery. I had an empire to run and a very specific piece of land to heal. I stood in the center of the Bear Creek woods, the crisp morning air biting pleasantly at my cheeks. The transformation of the land was nothing short of miraculous. Vanguard Holdings had poured millions of dollars into a massive, rigorous environmental cleanup over the last 6 months. We excavated every single ounce of the toxic industrial waste Richard had illegally buried. We sanitized the groundwater, completely restored the topsoil, and planted thousands of native saplings to repair the damaged ecosystem. The forest was finally breathing again. Footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel path behind me. I turned to see Jamal walking up the winding trail, a rolled-up set of thick architectural blueprints tucked securely under his arm. He wore a bright yellow hard hat and a thick canvas jacket, looking entirely in his element. Jamal had finalized his divorce months ago and stepped seamlessly into his new role as the Director of Sustainable Architecture for Vanguard Holdings. He was thriving. He had brought his mother Beatrice to the initial site inspection, treating her with the profound respect and dignity she deserved. She was incredibly proud of him, and he was finally free of the toxic leeches that had tried to drain his talent and his mother pension. "We did it," Ms. Williams, Jamal said, stopping beside me and unrolling the large blueprints across a wooden survey table we had set up in the clearing. "The final soil tests came back perfectly clean this morning. The EPA has officially lifted the hazardous designation from the entire property. We are completely cleared to begin the foundation work." I looked down at the sprawling architectural schematics. Jamal had completely redesigned the original plans. We were not building an exclusive off-grid wellness retreat for ultra-high net worth individuals. I had zero interest in providing a luxury playground for the rich. I was not going to pave over my past to build vacation homes for people exactly like my parents. Instead, Jamal had designed the Bear Creek Youth Sanctuary. It was a state-of-the-art survival education and psychological support center specifically built for at-risk teenagers and foster youth. The massive facility featured modern, secure residential cabins, comprehensive counseling centers, collaborative agricultural gardens, and vast outdoor wilderness training grounds. It was meticulously designed to be a safe haven for kids who had been abandoned, neglected, or thrown blindly into the broken foster care system. We were going to bring them here and teach them how to survive. Not just how to survive in the woods, but how to survive the trauma of being discarded by the people who were supposed to love them. We were going to provide them with the best therapists, the best educators, and the absolute unshakable certainty that they were not disposable. I was turning the exact location where my family had tried to destroy me into a fortress of healing for kids who shared my exact scars. "The main residential hall is going to look spectacular against the eastern tree line," Jamal pointed out, tracing the architectural lines with his index finger. "The natural light integration will make the interior spaces feel completely open and safe. We can start pouring the concrete foundation by Monday morning. Are you ready to officially break ground on this project?" I looked away from the detailed blueprints and gazed out at the sprawling, dense forest. The morning sun was just beginning to break through the towering pine trees, casting long, beautiful beams of golden light across the damp earth. The haunting, terrifying shadows that had plagued my nightmares for 18 long years were completely gone. The woods were no longer a cold, isolated prison where a teenager had been left to freeze to death. They were a foundation for the future. They were a promise that no child brought to this facility would ever have to face the darkness alone. "I am more than ready, Jamal," I replied, folding my hands casually into the pockets of my wool coat. "Let us get to work." Jamal smiled, a genuine, bright expression of professional pride and personal redemption. He carefully packed up his blueprints, securing them in his carrying tube, and headed back down the trail toward the busy construction trailers staging at the edge of the property line. I stayed behind for just a moment longer, standing completely alone in the very center of the clearing. I closed my eyes, tilted my head back, and took a long, deep breath of the crisp, clean air. My lungs filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, an absolute, untainted freedom. I had faced the monsters of my past, and I had completely eradicated them from my life. The scared 15-year-old girl who had sat shivering on a rotting log, waiting for a car that was never coming back, was finally at peace. I opened my eyes, looking out at my beautiful, thriving forest, and stepped forward into the light.